to our What's New in Cognos 10.2.1 webinar. We'll be starting in approximately 6 minutes. We're awfully glad to have you, and we hope you'll find the webinar informative. It will end with a question and answer session, so do be thinking about the questions you might have about this release or the recently put out FixPack 2, and we'll be back with you shortly. Thank you. Good afternoon, especially to those who have only recently joined the web conference. Thank you for attending our What's New in Cognos 10.2.1 webinar. We'll be getting started in approximately 3 minutes. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. The time is now noon Eastern Time, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Jesse McNulty. I'm a Business Development Manager here at LPA. I'm going to take the first 5 or so minutes of the presentation to talk a little bit about LPA, and then I'm going to hand it over to Mr. Rich Chester, who is our Director of Consulting. So if you've attended some of our webinars before, I'm sure you've seen Rich. We're broadcasting live from Rochester, New York today. Actually sunny here, so those of you down south, we're actually one up on you weather today. So Rich is with me here as well. Rich, want to say hi? Hi, everybody. As always, we're going to record this webinar, so if you have to drop off for a portion of it, we will post a playback early next week. So, all right, on that note, we're going to get started. Okay, upcoming events. All right, today's webinar, 10.2.1 Quick Spec 2. For those of you that are healthcare customers out there, if you happen to be going to the HIMSS conference, that's the big healthcare conference that's in Orlando this year, LPA will be there. We're going to have a booth. Our booth location number is 1692. Feel free to shoot us an email, or to show up at the booth. We'll probably have some other events there. If you're going to the conference, let us know. We'd love to meet you there. On the 20th, we're going to run an Intro to Predictive Analytics with SPSS Modeler webinar. So if you don't know much about SPSS yet, it's a great webinar just to get your feet wet and understand what all that's about. For hospitality customers, we're going to have an industry-specific event on budgeting and forecasting for the hospitality industry. That's going to be coming up on March 4th. And then on the 13th, we're going to essentially an add-on to what we're doing today. We're going to have a webinar on Introduction to IBM Cognos Advanced Visualizations. We ran something similar in November, so if you attend the one in November, it would be very similar to that. But that's coming up on the 13th. If you've seen the Rave engine and you've heard about these visualizations, but you don't know how to use them yet, you want to see what they're all about, that webinar is for you. As always, go to lpa.com/events to register. We also have a ton of playbacks available on lpa.com/resources, or go right to our YouTube page, which is youtube.com/LPA systems. You can see the entire list right there. Okay. About LPA, I mentioned a minute ago, we're broadcasting here from our corporate headquarters in Rochester, New York. We have several locations throughout the United States. Our customers are really spread all over. We have hundreds of active enterprise, mid-market, and OEM clients. So we really across the spectrum of the smallest to the biggest types of companies. We're an IBM Premier Business Partner. Only 4% of IBM partners can say that, so that's the top accreditation level. We're also an ESRI Silver Peer Partner, and I'll talk briefly about location analytics on the next slide. All of our consultants are certified. They've been doing Cognos, BI, FPM, TM1 solution. They've been doing these things for on average 10+ years. So we have very senior experienced consultants. And we have experience from data warehousing all the way up to predictive analytics. In 2013, we received an IBM Beacon Award finalist for one of our healthcare dashboard solutions we built on Cognos. So we're recognized as a leader in the business analytics space by IBM. All right, our business analytics offering. So we span all the way from if you're just getting started, if you're new to analytics, you don't have a data warehouse yet. We've got consulting around the thought process you need to go into before you go down that journey. So readiness assessments, strategy and roadmap, help developing a business case to move into analytics. So if you're just getting started, we've got the consulting services to help you get going. On the data warehouse side, we'll do architecture, design, and implementation services across a variety of different solutions. We obviously specialize in the IBM stack. The traditional Netezza appliance is certainly something that we promote in the data warehousing space. As we move up into business intelligence, that's really where we're talking today, and this is the Cognos brand. At LPA, we're 100% focused on IBM Cognos for BI. We have a variety of services, a lot of shrink wrap services from health checks to migrations, upgrades. We have SDK expertise. Pretty much anything in the Cognos stack, we've got consulting expertise that goes with it. Our most popular service offering is training. Rich Chester here, who's presenting today, is actually is the developer of all of our training materials at LPA. Our materials are customized with your data. We get great feedback. You know, it's a great way for your team and your end users to learn in the context of your data. So if you have any training initiatives going on in your organization, you know, reach out to us. I think our pricing is really good, and our training model, you know, is the best out there. An upgrade assessment. So in today's webinar, you know, Rich is going to be talking about Cognos 10.2.1. If you're not on 10.2.1 yet, if you're on the old 8 stack, I'm sure you've been told by IBM that you're currently out of support. At the end of September of last year, if you were on the 8 stack, you started being out of support. So it's time to start thinking about moving if you haven't already. If you're considering moving, LPA would love to meet with you and talk to you about what it typically takes, how much work on both sides. So we'd be happy to meet with you basically in about a 1-hour interview. We'll take you through a series of questions, and then after that, we'll be able to provide you a plan, what it will take to upgrade. We'll be able to tell you what we'd expect for remediations, you know, based on the questions we're going to ask you. We know where we've seen stuff break for other customers, so we got a pretty good idea of estimating what it's going to take to fix things. License recommendations if you're on any of the traditional roles, and then we'll provide you a summary of benefits versus your current version. This can help justify the upgrade often. Likewise, training recommendations if your team is trained up on 8, but they have to learn about 10.2. All right, next slide. The upgrade assessment, when we send an email after the webinar, we'll have a link to our website where you can just fill out a form, and then someone will reach out directly to set up a meeting to begin the process for that assessment. All right, the last slide before I turn over to Rich is just about licensing. A lot of you come to the Cognos stack from the 8 platform, which means that you probably have some legacy license levels like consumers or business authors. So if you're still in the traditional license model, the trade-up paths, the logical trade-up paths for you to consider are for your consumers, get them up to enhanced consumers so that they can start leveraging active reports, Cognos Workspace, mobile. So it's a logical trade-up path. Try to do that at your renewal time because you'll get some maintenance relief, and LPA would be happy to make some recommendations on how you can save some money on doing those trade-ups. Business author, you want to move up to advanced business author because you got to get off Query Studio and Analysis Studio. IBM's not really adding capabilities to those things anymore. The strategic platform or the strategic ad hoc tool for your business end users to start using for development is Cognos Workspace Advanced. So if you haven't already traded up your users from business authors to advanced business authors, consider doing that. All right, on that note, I'm going to turn over to Rich. Thank you, Rich.
Thanks, Jesse. Hi, everybody. So this is our agenda for today. We're going to talk about Cognos 10.2.1, and then we're also going to add in the changes that were introduced in the 2 fixed packs that are available. There's a fixed pack 1 and a fixed pack 2. Now, fixed pack 2 is all inclusive of what was in fixed pack 1. So you haven't got to actually apply 2 patches. You only apply the 1. But we're going to talk about what new things came with those patches in addition to what came between 10.2.0 and 10.2.1. And we're going to do that along the lines of some general comments. We'll talk about the big news, really, for this release, which was performance improvements. We'll talk then in detail about the different studios and different capabilities in terms of what's been changed or enhanced. And at the end, we'll take some questions and hopefully provide some answers. And that'll fill up the rest of this hour. So I'm going to move forward here and just talk to you in general what the 10.2.1 release brought. First of all, it brought a new look and feel. Once you go from 10.2.0 or any other earlier release onto 10.2.1, what you'll notice is that IBM's gotten a facelift in terms of the Cognos connection. For example, packages in the older versions used to be blue folders, and they looked like yellow folders, only blue, and there wasn't a clear delineation between the fact that it was both a package and a folder, and that it was primarily a package. Now, packages actually have a little package icon that's different than a folder icon. Fonts have changed. Some of the icons have changed. The return button is not a right angle arrow anymore. It's a curved arrow. So you'll see a difference. Nothing that's going to throw your users off, but you'll see a difference, a facelift in the user interface. Now, just to be sure, if you are a TM1 user as well as a Cognos BI user, upgrading to the latest version of Cognos BI doesn't mean you absolutely have to upgrade your TM1. There are always version compatibilities to look up, and they're all available online. But TM1 10.2.0 will work with BI 10.2.1. So it does work with the latest versions of both Insight and TM1 that are available today. And it works with some of the older ones. You need to look, though, because it's not 100% backward compatible on those items. There's a limited number of versions that work of those tools and fully integrate with BI. Big themes in the 10.2.1 release were visualizations, and they continued to enhance visualizations with the fixed packs. So it started out in a somewhat small way with active reports and this notion of an interactive visualization, and now it's any report in Report Studio or Cognos Workspace Advanced and active reports, and you can even display these things in Cognos Workspace. So that's big news. We'll talk more about that. Performance, performance, performance. One thing that IBM is focused on from a release-to-release perspective is making the tool faster. And we'll talk a bit about what they've achieved with the 10.2.1 release. And then we'll talk very quickly about some big data items and what the changes are relative to that. As I said before, the iFix Pack 2 is available. The way that the numbering system works now in the 10 world is it's not 10.2.1 Fix Pack 2. It's actually referred to as 10.2.1.2. So that's the latest and greatest release. That ultimately, if you're upgrading to 10.2.1, I recommend going right to .2 and not stopping at .0 or .1. Let's talk about the performance improvements that were part of this release in general. First of all, active reports. Optimization of active reports so they're smaller, use compression better, and take up less memory have resulted in large gains in terms of performance and much smaller active report MHT file sizes, which is welcome news. And you can see the statistics there relative to those improvements. Faster, smaller. I did take a report that I had written in 10.2, ran it in 10.2.1 with absolutely no changes, and it was about 65% of its original size without me having done anything to the report except run it a second time after upgrading. From a mobile perspective, the big change in mobile is that they've moved a lot of the heavy lifting off of the native app and back to the Cognos server, which is, in general, bigger, faster, stronger. Therefore, report retrieval and execution is now 300% faster on mobile than it was in previous releases. Dynamic cubes were introduced in the 10.2 release. They continue to invest heavily in dynamic cubes. A lot of the enhancements in Fix Pack 1 and in Fix Pack 2 were along the lines of making dynamic cubes even better. But these are memory resident OLAP cubes that are aggregate aware. So they're true ROLAP now in the BI stack. And the big improvements here are relative, since they are memory resident, the big improvements, as you might imagine, would be in memory usage. Put more in less memory, and because in memory resident they're fast. But if we can put more in there and we can more cleverly leverage the caching, we can get better performance, and that's exactly the kinds of enhancements that are in this release relative to dynamic cubes. From a report bursting perspective, it used to be that when you bursted reports in previous releases, one of your Cognos servers did all the work for that bursted report. It wasn't load balanceable, that burst. But in this latest release now, you can load balance bursting of a report across multiple report servers if you happen to be a multi-server install, and therefore you will get much faster burst execution after installing this release. The batch report service has been improved. It is now more fully aware of the CPUs that are on your servers, and it will make better use of your multi-CPU environment. And therefore, as it says here, we're seeing 25% improvements in overall batch report execution times. Additionally, Cognos has focused a lot on going to disk less in this release than it used to. And so it's done more with caching of files that it normally would go and read from the disk. It's caching that information when it can into memory, and as we all know, memory retrieval versus disk retrieval, memory retrieval is faster. So an 85% reduction in the amount of times it's hitting your disk throughout the day is achieved in this release. And then overall, Cognos is a multi-threaded environment. When you install Cognos and you run the Cognos services, it's multiple threads. You can tune how many threads are coming and going. But creating a thread and taking down a thread is an overhead that takes resources and time. So creating fewer and having to tear down fewer was part of this platform optimization. So threads communicate with each other better, and the number of threads needed is lower after installing this release, which results in performance improvements. The only news I'll share about big data is that we now can do big data activity with more sources. So I'm showing a Forrester wave here, and it shows the leaders in the big data world: AWS, IBM, of course, Hortonworks, Cloudera, and Cognos has, with the 10.2.1 release, incorporated support for those industry-leading big data source systems. In addition to the Apache open source, which is not something that Forrester has assessed, but Cognos has also added availability for big data from the Apache open source tool set. So that's the big data improvements here. We can go more heterogeneous in our data sources for big data. Now, poking down in a bit more detail on some things beyond those general things, let's talk a bit about architecture and administration. It used to be when you installed the 64-bit Cognos or the 32-bit Cognos server, that the gateway was always going to start out at 32 bits. You could change it to 64 by doing a process, but regardless of which install you did, the gateway was 32 bits. Now, the gateway matches the install kit. So if you install a 64-bit install kit, the default gateway is 64. You could change it to 32, but the default is now 64. So, and then with the 32-bit in the Windows world, because that's the only place 32-bit lives anymore in terms of install kits, you would then get the 32-bit gateway as the default for those. So that was different, and if you're used to having to switch that, now you won't have to moving forward so that your gateway and your install kit match. There are some new administration screens. We'll talk more about those in the sections on dynamic views and multi-tenancy, but there are some brand new components to Cognos administration that we'll see. External object stores for output archiving. We'll talk more about that as well. But Cognos will let you reduce the size of your content store by taking stored output, setting up an archive timeframe, older than X many days or after this many versions are saved, pick the older ones, and get them out of the content store, but make them still retrievable from the Cognos connection. And where can they go? Well, they can go to either FileNet or they can go to a folder structure on your Cognos server. In terms of my folders, in terms of backup and restore, you can now granularly deploy just the My folders. It used to be that My folders only came along for the ride with a full content store export. Now you don't have to do a full content store export to actually back up My folders. Because mobile's moved to the server, the audit reporting now includes all of the reports executed on the mobile devices. So you can use your audit database and the audit report to come out of the box to understand mobile activity now because of the architecture change to push more back onto the Cognos server. We talked about the burst options already. Jesse mentioned there are no new updates to Query Analysis or Event Studio. There are certainly bug fixes relative to those tools as the bugs come up. Cognos obviously is still fixing them because they're still supported tools. They're not enhancing them in this release nor in any of the fix packs to 10.2.1. With 10.2.1, Cognos has deprecated the cohort tool. This would have been a separate purchase and install of something called Cognos Statistics. That tool is no longer being sold and is therefore not part of the 10.2.1 family. As with all things moving forward, some of the older versions of things fall off. In this case, there are certain SAP portal versions that are no longer supported within this release, as listed here on the screen. Now, with FixPack 2, there was also an introduction of 4 new JDBC data sources, and they're listed on the screen here. So, as you create data sources, one of the options is to access by JDBC. The current version, when you install the FixPack 2 against this release, you see over in the corner, you see those are all of the types of JDBC connections you can now create using the data source wizard for JDBC connections. Now, Framework Manager is not updated all that often, but within the 10.2.1 release, there are a couple of changes to Framework Manager. First of all, there are some new governors that help you control performance in dynamic query mode. They're listed there on the screen relative to the context of your joins, how you use the local cache, how database cursors are used, and how long they're retained before they're released, and how master detail queries work in a relational world. So there are new governors relative to those. In addition, a lot of us use stored procedure query subjects and define those in Framework Manager. And Cognos never had a control over whether those are open in read-only mode or in read-write mode, and now there's a governor where you can be very specific about the transaction mode of stored procedure query subjects, whether they're open read-only or whether they're open read-write when they're executed. Now let's talk about Report Studio. Now anything on this slide that has an asterisk next to it, these changes are also available in Cognos Workspace Advanced. So when I get to the CWA component of the presentation, I won't revisit these. So these are available in both. The Microsoft Excel grouping item we'll have a separate slide on, so we'll talk a bit more about that. But this is the notion of when I have a grouped list or a crosspath, on my individual rows, I don't get a repeat of the values I've grouped as a default. And when I export to Excel 2007, they're not repeated on each row. Right? It retains my formatting. Sometimes it's nice to have that data repeat, especially if I'm exporting to do a data tab with my list report. Then I want all the values that are in those group columns to actually repeat on each row. I can turn that on or off now as to whether it retains those groups and dedupes, or whether it actually, when I export, will repeat the values in those grouped items. When you do text-based filters using the filter wizard in Report Studio or CWA, there are some new options. I'll show you the screenshot there. Data container and query naming is an important component of both good practices as well as using reports in Cognos Workspace. When I add a crosstab to a report, when I add a list to a report, I need to remember to name it, because when I use that report in Cognos Workspace, I'll see those names of those objects. Well, I now get a pop-up that has me rename objects as I add them, and also allows me to rename my queries or reuse existing queries. We'll see a bit more on that as well. And then specific to improvements, when I'm using a cube or an OLAP type source in my report, I have some new activities that I can do there, including quickly being able to display my crosstab values as percents rather than absolute numbers. Using ends with when I'm searching for members in long member lists and levels that have a ton of members beyond what Cognos will display. There's a search function. Always had starts with and contains. Now it has ends with. And then the slide I'll go into this bit in a bit more detail on is this notion of sharing sets. So stay tuned on that in a couple of slides and what that's all about. Also, with FixPack 1, and of course now part of FixPack 2 and the go forward, a lot of us have books we build by running 5 or 6 Report Studio reports, and we assemble by hand the outputs. Now in Report Studio, there's this new tool called a report reference, and I can actually reference those 5 or 6 reports in another report and run that report, the referencing report, and it'll actually assemble my book for me from all those other reports. So this is sort of like a build page 1 from this report, build page 2 from that report, run it, schedule it, and then it'll actually assemble my books for me rather than having me have to do that by hand. Now, back to that Excel 2007 output. So here is a group list. The group list does not repeat the product line on each row. In my report properties, and this is report by report, I could uncheck the default checked group repeating cells. And when I uncheck that, when I export to Excel, it'll actually repeat those grouped items. So I can turn that on or off as I desire on a report by report basis. It's by default checked. When I uncheck it, I'll get my data repeated. When it's checked, my data will come out grouped and not repeated, deduplicated in Excel. When I have a text-based filter and a report, when I'm using the filter wizard, I have a bunch of new capabilities. Used to be my text bases were always, here's my specific values, so camping equipment. Well, I now have the capability of saying starts with a C or ends with ing or contains red, or uses a SQL pattern with stars and asterisks and all of the things that I can do in Microsoft's, in a SQL statement like against SQL Server or against Oracle, where I would have a where clause with a like clause in it. I can use those kinds of things. So if you're a SQL person, you can now embed those in these filters created with this filter wizard that's been part of the tools for a while now. So new options relative to text-based filtering in Report Studio and CWA. So then here's this thing about when I add a new item to my report, it prompts me and asks me to name the item. And it also asks me which query I would like to use. And if I'm using a new query, I can actually type over the query name here. So instead of creating query 1, query 2, query 3, I can actually have it create Q revenue list, Q a region chart, and actually rename my queries here in addition to naming my charts and my lists and my cross tabs right here. So that's a big help. And again, the naming of the objects is a critical component now as we author reports, because those names used to be invisible. Now that we have Cognos Workspace and we're reusing these objects in workspaces, those names come up. So this prompted reminder to name them something other than list 1, list 2, combination chart 1, combination chart 2 is a real value add. In FixPack 2, when I do joins within Report Studio, I have a new property called a filter type. What this does is it lets me tell Cognos to try to optimize the join when it's a one-to-many join. And what Cognos will do is it will actually add a filter to the many side of your query so that it will filter the many side to the values retrieved after filtering the one side. And this can result in much, much faster one-to-many joins. They found that it could be as much as 100 times faster in the lab when IBM tested this feature out. So, do you have to use this feature? No, you can leave it to the default behavior. There are 3 options in terms of how it applies this filter to the many side. And you might experiment with performance on using one of those 3 options. But this is a way when you're doing joins within the report layer for Cognos to help optimize those joins. And I think this is especially useful when query 1 comes from data source 1 and query 2 comes from a separate data source where the Cognos server is actually executing the join rather than the database. So good news there from a report performance perspective in FixPack 2. Now, moving to Report Studio enhancements that are specific to when I'm using a cube as a data source. First of all, this show value as option is there, and now I can show it as a percent as opposed to the actual absolute values of my measure. So here I've got a percent of the summary on. I'm using a crosstab in this case, of course, because that's where this applies. So I've got axes, and I can do it on the x-axis, the y-axis, or on the corner that's common to both axes, the lower right-hand corner value. So I can convert my data to a percent just by changing this show data value, the show value as component, and that will flip my data for me in my crosstab. Additionally, in my crosstab, if I have a level with a lot of members in it, Cognos won't display all the members in the member view of the model. It will end the list of members that it can display with this search option. Starts, contains, those were always there. This is the new one. In the dialog for that search, you'll have an ends with capability now with this release. And here's that sharing sets thing that I told you to stay tuned for. So here's the notion of a shared set. Let's suppose that there's a set of members that I have developed in a report that is an important set for me to use in a bunch of reports. I'll take the example of an organization. Let's say that we have a list of countries that we consider our developing markets. And the developing markets list is not maintained anywhere specifically. It's just something that we know in our heads. Well, it would be a valuable thing to be able to create that developing market set in one report and then give it a name and add it as a shared set to the cube. So you see in the model, there's this notion of a shared set that's in the model. And then there's a report that contains the definition of a set. Now, I can write a bunch of other reports that now leverage my shared developing market set. and I only have to define it in that one initial report. And if I change that developing market set, let's suppose that Brazil graduates from a developing market to a standard market, and let's say Ecuador now becomes a new developing market country for me. Well, when I make that change in the report that hosts this shared set, all of the reports that are now referencing that shared set in them will inherit that change. So this is only dimensional, right? This is only when you're using a cube source. And we've done this sort of model level filter in Framework Manager often before, but you see there's no Framework Manager component to this cube. So now I have this notion of being able to create, if you will, shared filters that are specific to sets of members that I can define them in a report, and I can leverage them across multiple reports. And my end users now manage that definition, not my modeler. So I think this could be a very useful capability for folks who report from dimensional sources a lot. Moving into active reports, which I create with Report Studio, a couple of changes there. Under the active report properties piece in the Report Studio world, there are two new components. First of them, compress the active report output. So I do not have to use the canoe compression algorithm in my active report. By default, you will. You can uncheck the compress if that is desirable for you. The other one is scalable. Now, scalable, I don't know that is obvious what it does by its name. And what this is specifically there to support is when I display an active report on an iPad or an iOS type device. With scalable checked on the report, when I generate that MHT and I display it on my iPad or my iPhone, I can use pinch to zoom. If scalable is not checked, then pinch to zoom does not zoom. So scalable on, pinch to zoom, scalable off, no pinch to zoom. Both are on by default, so you would only come in here and turn them off if you have a particular reason not to compress or not to allow pinch to zoom functionality on your active reports. But the big news when 10.2.1 first came out was visualizations being introduced in the world of active reports. With FixPack 1 and beyond, this is now well beyond active reports and is available to any report written in Report Studio or Cognos Workspace Advanced, and those reports can become widgets in Cognos Workspace, and if those widgets contain a visualization, those widgets will display those visualizations in Cognos Workspace. So what's a visualization? Well, a visualization is a new tool in the toolbox. You drag it over just like you would drag over a list, a crosstab, a chart, or a map. It launches a wizard a lot like charts do. But you see, these guys are vastly different to the charts that already exist. So you'll hear this thing called RAVE, the Rapidly Adaptive Visualization Engine. The RAVE engine is now part of the Cognos 10.2.1 world. And its job is to render brand new graphics for your reports. So all of the things we know and love about charts, all still there. The charts are still there. There's still the chart engine from Cognos 8 embedded in the tool, as well as a new chart engine that came along with 10. Plus, I have now visualizations. Now, the cool thing about visualizations is there are people writing new visualizations and sharing them up on a website called analyticszone.com. So, if you will, these visualizations are sort of crowdsourced. And indeed, there's actually a tool you can download where you can create these visualizations yourself. Or if you download a visualization from analyticszone.com, you can use this tool and you can actually edit the visualization and make changes to it. Maybe as simple as changing the default colors, maybe more complex. But the notion here is that I can now extend Cognos' ability to visually project my data, allowing me to highlight new things beyond what a chart or a crosstab could highlight. And I can do this in absolutely any CWA or Report Studio report, and then leverage these in active reports as well as on Cognos Workspaces. And in active reports, I can actually animate these. And if you do attend our visualization webinar, you'll hear a lot more about this visualization capability, and we'll talk more then. But here's your quick introduction to the notion of visualizations as a new tool in your toolbox for expressing data in a picture which, as we all know, is worth at least 1,000 words. Now, let's move on to Cognos Workspace Advanced and talk about the things that are new that are specifically only in Cognos Workspace Advanced, like simplified custom grouping. And you've always been able to create custom groups in Cognos Workspace Advanced in the previous releases, but it's been a little kludgy. What they've done now is they've given you some right-click shortcuts to create custom groups, and that's to say, you know, these 3 products I'll call product group A, and these 7 products I'll call product group B, and I want to put product group A and product group B on my crosstab. That's what a custom group is, and now it's easier to create those custom groups in Cognos Workspace Advanced. In addition to all the things that we talked about relative to the Report Studio enhancements that were styled. Moving on to Cognos Workspace, the dashboard tool. If you are coming from a 10.1 world, you know this as Business Insight. In 10.2, it got changed to Business Insight. Maybe in 10.1.1, it got changed to Cognos Workspace as opposed to Business Insight. But it's changed. So if you're coming from an earlier version of 10, you might know this as Business Insight. This is the Cognos Workspace dashboards. Reuse my arsenal of reports that have interesting components in them, drag them onto multi-tab dashboards, and have end users, enhanced consumer type users, create dashboards on the fly from my library of standard reports. A couple of enhancements here. Mapping like items. I have a slide on this, but the notion here is if I use close year for one widget and I use ship year in another widget, I couldn't ever filter on year with one filter on both widgets because they were 2 different data items. Now I'm not stuck with 2 filters. I can actually combine those filters and tell Cognos, hey, yes, it's year, it's close year and ship year, but I'm going to have to create one filter for both of those data items. The contents of a filter in the slider and the select value filters were read once when the filter was added to the report, and it was kludgy to get them to reread the data from the database. So if you added new product lines, they wouldn't automatically show up in the filters on the Cognos Workspaces for product line because of when they read the data. Now you can tell it to automatically refresh and always get the newest data items from your database in terms of populating those filters. Drill behavior continues to be improved so that as I drill, I retain formatting and nesting, which was sometimes lost as I drilled on widgets in a workspace. And then there's a chart recommender that is part of Cognos Workspace that tells you, all right, if you want to display this data in a different form than it's currently displayed, what are the best forms to display it in? There are enhancements to that recommender that give you even better recommendations for how to view the data. With FixPack 1, you gain the ability to embed workspaces in other portals that is not the Cognos connection. You also can copy and paste widgets from one tab to another or into and out of the global area. And there's also a duplicate tabs functionality now with the FixPack applied. And this is when the RAID visualizations became available as widgets when they went beyond active reports and are now part of any report you can write. So those were improvements in FixPack 1. And of course, they're carried forward from that point on. So here's that map like item. So here's my example. I have year from one time query subject and year close date from another time query subject. And they're each in a different widget. And before this enhancement, I could not create one year filter that would filter year and year close date. I had no way to do that. With this enhancement, I can checkbox up here and say, allow me to multiply select data items to build one filter out of. Of course, they have to have the same data in them, right? I wouldn't want to mix product lines and years. But you see, in the case where I have 2 year query items, I can checkbox those 2 guys and it'll create one filter and filter both of these widgets using the year date. And of course, on this widget, this order method by year, it'll filter the close date, and on this other, it'll filter just year. The point is I get one filter to filter 2 widgets because the data is the same. It's related data items, but before this, I couldn't do this combination. Moving on to mobile. Mobile had a number of enhancements with the 10.2.1 world, and it did require that you download a new version of mobile from the iPad store. or what is it called, the Apple Store. And you would get a whole bunch of a new UI, a UI that looked more like a native app, more conformant to what you would expect on an iPad. You could email your users a URL in this release. You can generate a URL and email it to your users, and when they click on it, it automatically configures the iPad app. Because there were a number of things you had to set up. You had to type in a server address and things like that. And that was a bit hard for non-technical users. So now you can just email them a clickable link, and when they open the email on the iPad and they click that link, it configures the iPad app for them automatically. It's faster because we've taken some of the heavy lifting off of the device and put it back on your Cognos server. The improved rendering of HTML, higher fidelity of HTML, and a number of different ways, just moving forward the visual experience on the app. Cognos Workspace continues to get better and better in terms of how you interact with workspaces on the device. Zooming in on active reports, if you have that scalable checkbox link, you can do that pinch to zoom. It's auditing because we've moved things back to the server, so you've got audit logging now. And the prompting, the value prompts, the multi-select prompts, how those are presented and how you interact with them on the mobile device is much more touch-friendly than it was before this release. Now, there happens to be 2 fixed packs having been released for Cognos Mobile as well. And those are installed separate from the fixed packs for general BI. Because Cognos is a separate install over the top of your BI environment, it also has separate fixed packs. And there's fixed packs 2 and 3 out, and you're going to actually want to install both. Reason being, fixed pack 2, you apply to the software on your server. So on your Linux server, on your Unix server, on your Windows server, where you've got the mobile gateway and the mobile capabilities installed, you want to install fixed pack 2. So that's a server fixed pack. And with it, you'll get a new component in your administration screen labeled mobile. And the mobile component allows you to do a number of different configurations to help control the use of mobile. You also get the ability to secure mobile such that not every user can access the mobile portal. Some users you can grant that capability to, others you can take away. So you want to install FixPack 2 on the server, and part of what you'll get is this administration console. You'll also get the ability to update the welcome page for your iOS applications. This will now support both portrait and landscape views on your iPad app. Your workspace interaction improves yet again with this FixPack, so you can do more of the interactions that are common to using a Cognos workspace when you're on an IE browser or a Safari browser or something like that on a laptop. Active reports are improved in terms of their drill-through support. I can drill through from an active report to an active report. I have access to saved outputs and so on. All of these things are enabled by installing the mobile FixPack 2 on your Cognos server. In addition, you want to get FixPack 3, and that's very easy. What that means is install the latest and greatest version of the apps, either from the App Store for your iOS devices or from Google Play for your Android devices. And when I did this, I found that they have an iPhone app now available in the Apple Store. So it's no longer just iPad. It's iPad and iPhone on which there are apps. And when you download the newest version of the app, they come with FixPack 3 in them. And that new app will work with older versions of mobile. So you haven't got to be on 10.2.1.2 to use the new app. You can go way back to 10.1.1. But to get all the benefits of all the new features and functionality and capabilities, of course, you want to be on the latest and greatest on the server as well. Moving on now to dynamic cubes. Dynamic cubes are the memory resident role-app cubes, aggregate aware, reading data from relational and storing that data and caching in memory. They continue to enhance it. I'd say that the bulk of the enhancements in every fixed pack from 10.2.1 forward have been around dynamic cubes. Some of let's call them the featured improvements relative to dynamic cubes available to you in 10.2.1 is improved security options for dimensions and attributes. You can define your own database security tables and incorporate those now to secure the dimensions in your cube. Relative time in a cube world is a very important concept, and they continue to add additional relative time computation capability to the dynamic cube designers so that you can do a lot more relative time definitions. And indeed, with the fixed packs, that continues to be an improvement area, a focus for the enhancements. There's an auto designer that does an even better job of looking at the data in your database and determining levels and attributes that might belong to those levels in auto-generated dimensions in your model. You can now import InfoSphere warehouse cubing services metadata and create metadata from that to create equivalent dynamic cubes. And there's some additional administration enhancements on the Cognos administration portal that we'll take a look at. With the Fixed Pack 1, the big improvement there beyond some of this stuff was that there's now an API where if I wanted to, I could write a program that would actually create a dynamic cube model from scratch. So if I wanted to go that route like I could with Power Cube models, I can now do that with dynamic cubes. Now, this new console on the administration screen, under the status tab, which is the first tab when you land in administration, there's this thing called data stores. And what this allows me to do is it allows me to manage my dynamic cubes across all of the dispatches on which they may live. It used to be I have to hit each dispatcher individually and go and work in the query service on each of those dispatches separately. Now I have a one-stop shop for all of my dynamic cubes across all of my dispatches, and I can manage them all here, which is a terrific helper, especially in a multi-server environment. With FixPack 2, I continue to get more relative time functionality. And Cognos represents now that the relative time capabilities in PowerPlay transformer, which was pretty robust and pretty powerful. You can do now all the same things in the dynamic cube designer. So all of the relative time stuff that you're used to being able to define. I want same month 2 years ago. I want 2 weeks ago last year versus 2 weeks ago this year. All of those kinds of relative time calculations are possible. In addition, they've added the ability for you to turn on near real-time updates to your fact data. So if the data is changing in your back-end relational database that the cube is reading, we can turn on faster refresh of facts through the day so that you get more up-to-date information in your cube. Named sets can be defined within the modeling tool. So not only can I do shared sets within the reports that use dynamic cubes if I want to, I could also define named sets and leverage those and manage those centrally as opposed to having my users manage those. If I'd like to, memory, dynamic cubes run on top of dynamic query mode. Dynamic query mode is all about good use of memory for rapid fire, rapid response reporting. So continued improvements relative to memory. And then Aggregate Advisor, which takes a look at all the queries that have been running against my dynamic cubes and suggests that, you know, if you added an aggregate table at this level of your dimensions, you would get better response in your reports. There have been improvements to its recommendations and how it instantiates those recommendations. From a multi-tenancy perspective, multi-tenant was introduced with the 10.2.1 world. 2.0 world, and with 10.2.1 has continued to be enhanced. Onboarding, removing, locking out, exporting data, importing data, default profiles, all of those sorts of things. You could do some of those when the multi-tenant became first available. They were kludgy. You had to add things to URLs. You had to log in as a member of a tenant before the tenant was available so you could secure objects. No longer the case. Now there's a brand new administration tab on which I can manage all of my tenants. And indeed, until I've added the tenant on this administration tab, no users from that tenant can log into Cognos. But once I've added them to my, here's the administration tab. So once I've added a tenant to the multi-tenancy tab in the administration, I can then enable them, disable them. Maybe I want to disable them while I'm upgrading their content. I can terminate all their sessions before I disable them. That way I know nobody's on while I'm deleting and changing and adding things to their content. I can change and create, I can create first and then change or delete a default profile. So if I want to give them a default skin, I want to give them alternating backgrounds, I want all of their outputs to be PDFs, I can do that on a tenant-by-tenant basis. And of course, I can also remove a tenant. And here I can also tell it to export just this tenant's content, so I can import it into a different environment if I'm moving a tenant from server 1 to server 2. So all of that can now be done in a succinct and very straightforward way through this multi-tenancy administration interface, where before it was harder to do. Not that these are necessarily new capabilities. When multi-tenancy was introduced, though, they were harder to do than they are now that we have this terrific tab to do them on. With FixPack 1, I was able to do something called impersonation, which is a great thing. Let's suppose that I have a multi-tenant environment. I've configured the environment for a tenant, and I want to see what the tenant would see. But I can't log on as one of these tenants, let's suppose. But I want, as an administrator, I want to look at the system the way my tenant will see it so I know if I got it right. Well, I can actually click on a little mask icon, and I can pick the tenant to impersonate, and I will see the Cognos connection and all of the contents of the Cognos connection, not as an administrator, but as though I had signed on as a member of that tenant. So that helps me check things before I enable my tenants to log on and use what I've set up. Additionally, in FixPack 2, let's see. This slide appears to be out of order. Oh, no, this is just extra stuff. Okay. Oh, well, I'm all the way to the end. Oh, that was fast. So anyway, so from an additional perspective, here you go. In Report Studio with FixPack 2, Cognos has recognized that there are aggregate functions in databases, including functions that you may have created yourself in the database, that the expression editor will not let you enter. Cognos won't recognize them, therefore it'll call that an error in your expression, even though you're referencing a perfectly valid in the database aggregate function. If you precede now those functions with the word aggregate and then a colon, Cognos will say, all right, I trust you, and it'll pass that through the database and it'll no longer throw an error in the expression editor. So I thought that was kind of new. Now, if you're using TM1, 10.2.0.1 or newer, you can fix ragged hierarchies by allowing Cognos to generate filler members so that it balances all the hierarchies and doesn't leave them ragged. So if you are dealing with ragged hierarchies in TM1 and that's vexing for you, with this FixPack, you'll be able to essentially balance those hierarchies with automatically generated filler members if you want to, and that will make ad hoc users especially find your TM1 cubes much easier to create reports from. So that didn't sort of fit in any of the other slides, so I wanted to make sure that you were aware of that with the FixPack 2 from an enhancements perspective. And I can breathe. That's it. It's a lot. We went through a lot of things really fast, which is why we'll have some deep dive webinars as the year goes by. But that's the collection of enhancements available to you as you go all the way up to Cognos release 10.2.1.2. And now we'll take any questions you have.
Okay, Rich, there's been a good number of questions answered throughout the presentation. I think some of them got answered along the way, so I'll try to ask the ones that I think are probably still outstanding. The first one is Android versus iOS. Are we aware of any differences between what you can do in the Android app versus the iOS app?
I believe that the current FixPack has very specific information about what things are enhanced only on the iOS platform and what things are across the board. So there are definitely differences in capabilities, and there is different capabilities that have been enabled, especially in FixPack 2, for example, on the iOS platform than were in the Android. But they do a pretty good job of the documentation calling out which those are.
Okay, so I think when we send the follow-up email to everyone after this event, we'll include a link to the FixPack, the IBM FixPack documentation that enumerates all of these things. There's a couple other very specific questions around that I think that FixPack documentation covers well.
Yeah, probably.
So we'll include that.
And if it doesn't, you can always respond back to us and ask us more questions.
So another question came in around 5 minutes into your presentation. It was just about the statistics, so I'm pretty sure it's probably around performance. The question was just what's the source of those numbers?
Oh, that's from IBM. So that's from IBM Labs. So if you will, when IBM announced the release, they sent out a bunch of information about what 10.2.1 brought to the table in terms of performance improvements. I merely copied that information and dropped it in the file.
So we have, there's a one-page document I have that summarizes those metrics. So it might provide a little bit more insight, and it might include some references for you in there. So in the follow-up email, we'll provide a link to that performance improvement summary document that IBM provides. And if people are having different experiences with the platform and not seeing it in some cases, or they're seeing more, shoot us an email. Let us know. We like to collect this information, and obviously, we're working with hundreds of customers, so so we can help share information, based on what people are actually saying.
Yeah.
The upgrade process from 10.2 to 10.2.1. So can you describe? There's some questions around upgraded stuff. Are these reinstalls, and then talk about the fix packs and what they are?
Sure. So the rule of thumb is this: if one of the first three numbers changes, it's a reinstall. So it's a back up your config, back up any changes you've made on the server to XML files, install the new item, apply those changes, and start up. So that's not a install in place ever at the moment when one of the first three numbers changes. When the fourth number changes, that's an overlay. That's when a fix pack is applied, and fix packs don't require an uninstall, reinstall. Fix packs are an overlay. But be aware, sometimes fix packs replace the very files we changed. So you will need to be sure before you apply a fix pack, if you've made customizations to the environment, if you've changed XML files in the install directory, the fix pack may overlay some of those. So while it's not an uninstall, reinstall, you may still have to reapply some of your changes. What I found is I had a custom skin, and new icons were added in a release. Some changes were made there, and I needed to recreate my custom skin, even though it wasn't an uninstall, reinstall. So first three numbers change. Think of it as a new release. Last numbers change. It's an overlay of updates on top of the software.
It's just a follow-up question on the performance improvements. So if a customer is not using DQM, will they still see those performance improvements, or were they all around DQM?
No, most of the performance improvements were not around DQM per se. Like the active reports ones are not on DQM. The threading, the less use of disk, all of those things. The lion's share of the improvements are improvements across the board. But there are a collection of improvements that are really specific to dynamic query mode and the use of memory that would only apply if you're using DQM. But I'd say more than half of the improvements overall for performance apply to everybody, DQM or CQM users.
The next question is also on performance along with 6458, right?
Yeah.
So can that actually improve performance?
The gateways are all about the static content. They're not about how fast the report runs. How fast the report runs is really about the queries that are generated. So the query service, the presentation service, the report service, none of those are gateway components. They control far more how fast your report runs per se. However, a 64-bit gateway could display static content faster than the 32-bit gateway. I personally have not found a lot of instances where I would say I've seen a measurable difference in the speed there. But I have heard anecdotally of customers who did get a slight improvement. But the biggest improvements to report runtime are going to be about optimizing your queries and the size, the speed, and the release you're on the Cognos application and content tiers, not so much the gateway tier.
All right, we'll take one more question here, and this is around my folders.
Sure.
So I think this was when can an administrator create subfolders for globally for users' my folders and set permissions within those subfolders?
Globally?
Yeah.
I'm not aware of any way to do that. Certainly on a case-by-case basis, yes. But I'm not aware of a way for you to create, let's say, a user profile that says, not only when the user logs in for the first time, I want you to create the profile with this skin and this these settings and this language as the defaults. Also create these 12 folders with these properties. I know of no way to do that.
I think that's like an SDK use case. I think is awesome. Scripting type use case.
Yeah, if you needed to do something like that, if you needed to automate the onboarding and do a number of settings beyond what the profile stuff does, that is definitely an SDK use case.
Okay. There's a couple very specific questions around some issues that one person ran into and stuff like that. So we'll follow up one-off with some of those very, very specific questions.
Sure.
The time is now 1 o'clock, so we appreciate everyone joining us today. Please join us for the Advanced Visualization webinar that's coming up in about 2 weeks there with LPA.com events to go sign up for those.
Yeah.
And thanks everyone for attending.
Yeah.